Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today for today's event, an agenda for higher education reform with Senator Lamar Alexander and a distinguished group of panelists. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, and I get the pleasure of welcoming you here and introducing the Senator. And we're just glad that you're here at this important time. As many of you are aware, it's been over a decade since Congress first passed the Higher Education Act, which covers the federal government's student aid programs, Pell Grants, student loans, and things like that. And in the time that's transpired, a lot of things have changed in the higher education system in America, and reform is overdue. And so we are looking forward to hearing from the Senator on his vision for this act and for higher education going forward more generally. And I just want to let you know this event is being live streamed, and a video will be available immediately after we finish. So before we begin, let me just ask you to take a moment to silence your cell phone as I introduce the Senator, which I'm pleased to do. Lamar Alexander is a seventh-generation Tennessean. He was born and raised in Maryville, and he was elected twice as governor of Tennessee before serving in the Senate. And I remember these days, as we were talking earlier, as someone who has worked for a governor and follows governors. I think that's one of the most interesting jobs in public policy. And he developed a reputation very early on for someone who vigorously preserved the sovereignty of states, those powers that were not relegated to the Constitution, and very early on was well known as an advocate for and a proponent of federalism in America, a reputation that he's continued on to the Senate, to which he was elected in 2002. He's been elected twice since that time, and his colleagues have elected him 3 times as chairman of the Senate Republican Conference. Today, Senator Alexander chairs the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and he also serves as the chairman of the Senate Energy and Water Development Appropriations Subcommittee. His record of public service goes back before he was governor. Assuming many of you know this, but many of you may not, he served as the president of the University of Tennessee, and after that as the U.S. Secretary of Education under George H.W. Bush. In 2016, the nation's governors created the James Madison Award to recognize members of Congress who support federalism and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And Senator Alexander was the first ever recipient of the award for his work fixing the No Child Left Behind Act, which at the time the Wall Street Journal called the largest devolution of federal power to the states in a quarter of a century. And in 2013, the National Conference of State Legislatures gave the Senator the Restoring the Balance Award for protecting states' rights, the first time in 10 years they had awarded this particular award to a U.S. Senator. Now, what I didn't know until preparing for this event is that Senator Alexander is also a classical and country pianist and the author of 7 books. He and his wife, Honey, have 4 children and 9 grandchildren and a dog named Rufus. So, Senator Alexander, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, to Arthur Brooks and the American Enterprise Institute. Jason Delisle, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me. When I was governor, I once spoke to an audience that included Alex Haley, the author of Roots, who was a marvelous storyteller. And after I finished, Alex came up to me and said, "May I make a suggestion?" I said, "Well, of course." He said, "If, when you begin talking, you would say, instead of making a speech, I want to tell you a story, people might actually listen to what you have to say." So I've tried to remember that ever since, and have tried to begin any statement with a story, including that story. And if I had to select a story for today, it'd be a story that any one of perhaps millions of Americans who are students or who recently were students might write. This is what a college graduate paying more than $1,000 per month in student loans recently wrote to the New York Times. He said, quote, "I was told to chase down a bachelor's degree by any means necessary, but no one mentions just how expensive and soul-crushing the debt will be," unquote. The United States has most of the best colleges in the world, and it also has the most graduates paying off college debt. Roughly 40 million borrowers owe $1.5 trillion in collective student loan debt. The questions I hear most often from students about college are: 1, can I afford it? 2, is it worth it? And 3, can you make applying for financial aid and repaying student loans simpler? And then from administrators as well, they ask, can't you do something about the jungle of red tape that makes it so hard to apply for federal financial aid, to pay back student loans, and that wastes money on overhead that ought to be spent on students? And today I have 3 proposals that I hope will make answering all those questions yes. First, simplify the FAFSA. Now I have one here, just in case you don't know what I'm talking about. 20 million American families fill this out every year. You do it online, but it's still 108 questions, most of them unnecessary. And assuming you fill it out and you get your Pell Grant, then about halfway through the first semester, someone calls you up and wants to verify your information and stop your money while you're doing that. So we can cut from 108 to no more than 24 the number of questions on the dreaded federal student aid application form, the FAFSA, that the 20 million families fill out every year, a prerequisite if you want a federal Pell Grant or a student loan. At our first hearing on updating the FAFSA in the Higher Education Act discussion in 2013, Kim Cook from the National College Access Network testified that just that simplification should encourage 2 million more students to apply for federal grants or loans that would make college more affordable for them. Second, a new way to repay student loans is my second proposal. We should scrap the current system of 9 different ways to repay federal loans that was described by Dr. Susan Donarski, a professor at the University of Michigan, at another one of our hearings, when she said it had become, quote, a rigid, archaic payment system that unnecessarily plunges millions into financial distress, unquote. I propose that we scrap it and replace it with 2 options, both of which would be automatically deducted from your paychecks. The option I believe most borrowers would choose is a repayment plan based upon a borrower's income, which would never require the borrower to make payments of more than 10% of his or her discretionary income. And it makes sure that if there were no money earned, there would be no money owed, and that would not reflect negatively on the borrower's credit. The other option would be a 10-year repayment plan with equal monthly payments, a lot like a 10-year mortgage. My third proposal is a new accountability system for colleges based upon whether borrowers are actually repaying their student loans. This should help lower tuition at some programs or even discourage schools from offering programs that are not worth it to students. All 3 of these proposals should help students afford college and make sure the degree that they earn is worth the time and money they pay for it. And I want to acknowledge Jason Delisle, from whom I stole that phrase of making college worth it. During the last 4 years, our Senate Education Committee has had 27 bipartisan hearings. They've resulted in a number of bipartisan proposals to make college more affordable and worth students' time and money. Here are a few of them. Senator Jones of Alabama and I, along with Senator Bennett of Colorado and Senator Collins of Maine, have worked on our way to simplify the FAFSA. Last year, Senator Patty Murray, who's the ranking Democrat on the committee, and I introduced and the Senate passed a bill that would have eliminated 22 of the questions on the FAFSA or allowed students to answer them with just 1 click. Senator Burr and King have offered a way to simplify the bewildering loan repayment system. There are a lot of other good ideas. A few of them include Senator Murphy, Enzi, Hassan are interested in expanding competency-based education programs on campuses. Professor Walter Russell Mead describes these programs as, quote, measuring whether a student is learning stuff instead of measuring how long he or she sits in their seat, unquote. Senators Grassley and Smith have proposed requiring all institutions to use uniform language and award letters so students can tell what the award is. I used to be against that because I'm pretty adverse to federal rules. But with so many students receiving letters every year that do not make it clear what you have to pay back and what you don't, I think a requirement that they do is a good idea. Senators Grassley and Smith have also proposed making it easier for institutions to counsel students about how much money they should borrow. Today, universities have handcuffs on them in that respect. Senator Cassidy and Warren have introduced legislation to collect data that would help consumers make better educated decisions on where to go to school by providing program-level information on how much debt students can take on and how much they earn after college. Last Congress, Senators Shaheen and Hatch introduced legislation to create a student loan repayment accountability system. I hope you'll notice that these senators are both Democrat and Republican in every case. I've talked with other senators on our committee who are interested in similar ideas. Senator Murphy and Warren want to expand Pell Grants to prisoners. Senators Young and Hassan are interested in experimental sites. Senator Kaine and I discussed allowing students to use their Pell Grants to pay for shorter programs. And in addition, in 2013, Senators Bennett, Mikulski, Burr, and I asked a cross-section of college administrators to recommend specific steps, not speeches, specific steps to make more effective and simplify the thousands of pages of regulations that accompany the grants and loans that help students pay for college. The result was the Kerwin-Zepost report that had 59 recommendations to eliminate what the report called a jungle of red tape that wastes money on costly overhead that could instead be spent on students. This year I've met with Senator Murray, the ranking Democrat on our committee, 9 other committee members to talk about compiling all of these ideas into a single piece of legislation and moving ahead together. My goal is to report that legislation out by this spring of our committee so the full Senate can consider it in the summer. That schedule should permit a conference with the House of Representatives on their version of reforms to the Higher Education Act so that we can produce a present for 20 million college students and their families by Christmas. Before I go into a little more detail on the 3 proposals, I'd like to mention the remarkable growth of higher education in the United States. Our system, the federal government system, of grants and loans to help students pay for college is one of the most successful federal programs, and it's certainly one of the most generous. Federal aid began with the GI Bill for veterans in 1944. As veterans came back from World War II, they were offered scholarships at the college of their choice. Then only about 5% of Americans had earned bachelor's degrees, mostly from private institutions. The GI Bill model for students taking federal dollars to the institution of their choice has expanded over the years. Congress created a limited federal loan program in 1958 and expanded federal student loans to all students in the Higher Education Act of 1965. By then, about 10% of Americans had a college degree. Then in 1972 came the Pell Grants that were created to help students from lower income families go to college. This aid has helped to make a college degree widely affordable for students to attend 6,000 institutions that are among the best in the world. Last year, 60% of our country's 20 million college students received federal aid, $28 billion in grants that they don't have to pay back, and $90 billion in new loans that they do. And today, about 35% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. That's just the federal government's generosity. That's supplemented by state government. 80% of college students today attend public institutions that receive $87 billion from the states each year. Tennessee, I'm proud to say, became the first state in the country to make 2 years of college free for everyone, an effort led by our governor then, Bill Haslam. And now we have 16 states with similar programs. And there's a vast system of private scholarships, loans, work programs to assist students who want a college education. Paying for college is never easy, but because of such generosity by taxpayers, foundations, and private individuals, paying for college is easier than many people think. In addition to the 16 states where 2 years of college is tuition-free for many students, for most students from lower-income families, 2 years of college is nearly tuition-free. The average tuition for community college in this country is $3,700. The average federal Pell Grant, which does not have to be paid back, is $3,900. Public universities have tuition levels that are reasonably low. For example, at the University of Tennessee, it's $13,000 a year. More and more private institutions, such as Vanderbilt, are guaranteeing students who are admitted that they won't have to pay more than their family can afford. And while the total student debt is large, at $1.5 trillion, for the graduate with a 4-year degree, the average student loan is just under $30,000, about the same as an average car loan. Nevertheless, despite this extraordinary generosity, many students struggle to pay for college and to pay off debts they incur to go to college. That's why I'm offering these 3 proposals today. First, simplifying the FAFSA. The cumbersome FAFSA is the major impediment to low-income students going to college in the United States today. They and their parents are intimidated by the complexity, are wary of the government form, and don't see why they should have to give to the Department of Education information they've already given to the Internal Revenue Service. The former president of Southwest Community College in Memphis told me he believes he loses 1,500 students each semester because of the complexity of the FAFSA. Now again, this is a state where tuition is free if you just fill out the FAFSA. A woman who is mentored with Tennessee's free tuition program, the Tennessee Promise Program, said the complex form has a, quote, chilling effect, intimidating parents who may themselves have never attended college and have no experience navigating the process. And over again, I've had families tell me, I've already given this information once to the federal government when I paid my taxes. Why do I have to do that again? Once ought to be enough. To make matters worse, there is the verification process that I mentioned earlier. It stops the payments of Pell Grants while the family scrambles to resubmit tax information again, and the government checks to make sure that every single dot and cross letter is accurate. I recently talked with another administrator from Southwest Community College in Memphis who told me that 1/3 of the applicants who put down the school as an option on their FAFSA application were selected for this verification process last fall. At a student where over 60% of students receive Pell Grants, this is a huge burden. This is happening all across our state. The president of East Tennessee State University, at the other end of Tennessee, told me that 1/3 of his students who receive federal financial aid were subjected to this verification process this year. So I have 2 proposals to simplify the FAFSA. The first is Senator Jones of Alabama and I, along with Senator Bennett, who's worked with me on this for several years, and Senator Collins. We're reintroducing legislation soon that would reduce the number of questions from 108 to 15 to 25 basic questions about a student, their family, their plans for college. We would continue to provide the information that states and institutions use to calculate additional aid to prevent students and families from having to complete additional paperwork down the line. Senator Jones and my legislation would allow students as young as middle school to easily learn about their likely Pell Grant award with a phone app or chart so they can begin to plan and think about college. The second way to simplify the FAFSA is legislation that the Senate passed last year. I mentioned that earlier as well, that Senator Patty Murray and I had introduced and which we plan to introduce again this year. This would allow families to answer up to 22 FAFSA questions with just 1 click. It does this by ending the need for families to give the same information to 2 different government agencies, the Department of Education and the Internal Revenue Service. It would also simplify the burdensome application process for the 40% of applicants who don't file federal income taxes but likely qualify for Pell Grants. It would dramatically decrease the number of students whose aid is tangled up when they are selected for the verification process that I've described. And it would eliminate, from the taxpayer's point of view, it would eliminate the estimated $6 billion in mistakes that the Treasury Department says are made each year by awarding an applicant too much or too little aid. Now, my second proposal is to help make federal loans more affordable once students graduate by scrapping the system of 9 different ways to repay your student loan and consolidate that into 2 options. The current system is so complex, that is, to repay your student loan, that even college administrators have a hard time with it. At a round table at the University of Tennessee Martin, a Tennessee college president told me that it took him months to figure out how to help his daughter repay all her federal student loans when they had the money in hand. So this new proposal would streamline those 9 plans into a new option that guarantees that borrowers would never have to pay more than 10% of their income that is not needed for necessities. And if a borrower loses his or her job and doesn't make enough to make a payment, they would not pay anything, and it would not hurt their credit score. The monthly payment would be automatically withheld from borrowers' paychecks, just like federal taxes. Now, I believe every student under this new plan will want to take advantage of this simple and affordable new option, but if not, they'll still be able to opt to pay on the existing 10-year loan repayment plan schedule, which for many borrowers will help them pay off their loans faster. And just like the new income-based repayment plan I described, they would have their payments automatically deducted from their paycheck. So let's talk about how this would work. Here's an example. Joe earned his bachelor's degree in engineering. He has the average loan for 4-year college graduates of $28,500. He makes $60,000, which is what the Census Bureau says is the median starting salary for someone with an engineering degree. He's unmarried, he has no children. So that year we take the portion of Joe's income that's needed for necessities by government formula, that's about $18,735, and what is left is what we call his discretionary income, about $41,000. Joe will pay 10% of that $41,000 a year, which is $41,027, or $343 a month. Under this proposal, if Joe, the engineering graduate, never gets a raise, he'll pay back his loan in 9 years. Now, I have some other examples. Maya, she gets a bachelor's degree in economics. She has the average loan of $28,500. But her starting salary is less, $43,000, the median starting salary for someone with a degree in economics, according to the Census Bureau. She's also unmarried, no children. So we deduct the same thing for necessities, $18,735, but she has less discretionary income to spend than Joe did. So she's going to pay less. She'll pay 10% of about $24,000, which is $2,400 a year or $200 a month. Under this proposal, even if she never gets a raise, Maya will pay back her loan in 16 years. Or Stephanie, who earns her associate's degree from a community college, $10,000 in student loan debt, the median amount a recent community college graduate would expect to have. Her starting salary is $39,000. The median salary for a 25 to 29-year-old with an associate's degree, she's unmarried, 1 child. So the portion of her income that's needed for necessities is larger, $25,365, because it's supporting 2 people. That leaves her with a smaller discretionary income to pay back her student loan, $13,000. She'll pay 10% of that, $1,364, or $114 a month. Under this proposal, she'll pay back the loan in 10 years, even if she never gets a raise. Now let's look at one other example of someone who's not able to pay back a loan. Let's take John. He went to community college for a year. He took out $7,500 in student loans, but he dropped out after his first year. He makes $20,000 a year in his job. He's unmarried, no children. So we deduct a portion of his income needed for necessities. That's almost everything he earns, $18,700. That leaves his discretionary income at $1,200. John will pay 10% of that, which is about $120 a year, $1,265 a year, $120 a month. So under this proposal, John won't have paid off his loan over 20 years. But under current law, if he's not able to pay it back over 20 years, that loan is forgiven, which seems like a policy we should keep. So under this payment system, students will have a manageable payment. Most will completely pay off their loans, which is good for the student and good for the taxpayer. And it should end the nightmare that many students have worrying how they're going to pay off their student loans. Now, finally, my third proposal is a new accountability system for college to make sure that the degrees they offer are worth students' time and money. This new accountability system would measure whether students are actually paying off their loans, the students who attend that college. The proposal would simplify and expand the so-called gainful employment rule proposed in 2014 by the U.S. Department of Education. What is different about this proposal is that it would apply to every program and it would apply to every college, public, private, and nonprofit, and the measure would be much simpler. For some programs, this should provide colleges with an incentive to lower tuition and help their students finish their degrees and find jobs so they can repay their loans. Now, I've listed a number of proposals by many senators that have bipartisan support, and one would think that we could go ahead with those and turn those into law. But there are other proposals that are going to be difficult to work with. They're good ideas, but they're hard problems to solve. One of those includes rules about campus safety. The U.S. Department of Education has proposed a rule addressing campus safety by clarifying what is required by Title IX. I'm glad to see the department is going through the rulemaking process. This allows the public to submit comments. Universities and students deserve to have certainty about what the Title IX rules are, but it's my belief that Congress can also address a number of these issues. And I'm committed to working with Senator Murray to try to do just that. We have a committee with many different voices and diverse views, but we've been successful in bringing legislation with broad bipartisan support, including fixing federal student loans a few years ago, the law fixing No Child Left Behind, which President Obama called a Christmas miracle, the 21st Century Cures Act, which Senator McConnell, the majority leader, said was the most important legislation of that Congress, and more recently, landmark legislation to combat the opioid crisis. All of these were complex, difficult issues to solve, but we were able to do what the United States Senate ought to be able to do, listen to one another, look for areas of agreement, and produce a result. So my hope is that we will be able to do that once again with higher education, that we can answer those three questions that I mentioned earlier, and barring Jason's suggestion, that we can do our best to say to 20 million families and 20 million students that yes is the answer to the question, can we make college more affordable, and can we make it simpler to apply for federal aid and to pay back loans, and can we make it worth it? Thank you very much.
I'm Jason Delisle. I'm a resident fellow here at AEI working on higher education policy. So I get the privilege.
I look like the garbage man with all this stuff.
I get the privilege of asking you a few questions before we open it up to the audience. I wanted to first ask you about the FAFSA simplification. I mean, everybody should be for simplifying this tangled mess of questions. But it seems that this idea has been around for a while, and the big hang-up is that every one of those questions is a way of sort of targeting aid to people who actually don't have the means, but sort of finding people who might have the means but don't look like it just by a straight income test. Yeah. So really you could be giving aid, by simplifying, you could be giving aid to people who have assets but low income. And then you end up spending resources to simplify.
Well, we've thought of that, and the time we've taken to work through those questions has addressed exactly that. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Department of Treasury estimates that with all of this information, there are about $6 billion of mistakes every year, paying too much or too little. And as I mentioned also, at least 22 of the questions have to do with information already given to the Internal Revenue Service, which is the basic information about whether you qualify or whether you don't. So one would think that you'd need all those questions in order to make sure you don't waste $130 or $40 billion a year. But all of the testimony we had was that these questions were unnecessary. And Senator Bennett of Colorado and I were at that same hearing a few years ago when all four of the witnesses who came from different points of view all agreed on that. And they said we should be able to reduce the 108 questions to 2 questions. Well, we couldn't do that, but we do believe that talking with student administrators, colleges, states, dealing with the issue you just talked about, that we can get it down to between 15 and 25 questions. And by doing that, greatly get rid of the intimidating, chilling complexity that discourages as many as 2 million students a year from applying for federal aid.
Okay.
These are the students that we would hope would go to college, and they're the ones whose parents or themselves say, we're not going to fool with that.
So it may sort of come out in the wash, the added resources that might be needed to simplify.
Well, it's going to cost more money. I mean, okay. People are often say, we want to spend more on higher education, we want to make it affordable. I think probably the single quickest and best way to make college more affordable to the largest number of low-income students is to simplify the FAFSA so that 2 million students are not intimidated from applying for it. I mean, here we are in Tennessee. College, 2-year college is free. The tuition is free, both for students and for adults. But first, you have to get all the money you can from the federal government through the FAFSA. And the mentors, the university people there say the single biggest barrier remaining to those adults and kids going to college is this 108 questions.
So speaking of money, in any big reauthorization and reform of the Higher Education Act, the question comes up, is this going to increase spending relative to what we do now, or is it going to be budget neutral, or is it going to save money?
Well, we're the authorizing committee, to use Senate speak, which means that if you're going to appropriate more money, that's the Appropriations Committee or the Finance Committee. So our job is the policy, and we'll try to come up with something that's budget neutral. Now, we'll have members of the committee who have very different ideas about that. They'll want to spend a lot more money, but it's not up to our committee to spend that money. We set the policy, and then the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee largely decide whether we've got the money to spend.
So I'm just going to one more question on this. You gave, before I turn it over to the audience, you gave a bunch of examples about undergraduates, but I didn't hear anything about graduate students. And if we're talking about student loans, there's a lot of interest in graduate student debt. The federal student debt that's outstanding, some 40, maybe even 50% of it is financed graduate school. And there was a big article a few months back in the Wall Street Journal about an orthodontist who's borrowed $1 million and is going to have debt forgiven while earning 6 figures under the existing income-based repayment plan.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's an appetite and interest in trying to solve that kind of problem. And some people have said these are outlier examples. I actually think they're more of the upper bound, where people even earning less or borrowing less are still getting loan forgiveness, but for graduate school.
Well, the answer is yes to your question. We should address it. It surprises people to learn the average loan for an undergraduate, college graduate is $28,500, about the same as a car loan. And you're correct. Most of the loans we read about that are big and are hard to pay back are graduate loans where you have almost no limits in some cases on what you can borrow. So the first problem is that people are borrowing more than they should. And we need in our law to make it easier for colleges, program by program, to persuade students not to do that. Or a second problem is the Grassley-Smith letter, which says this amount you have to pay back, this amount you don't. It's not clear all the time what that's true. Secretary DeVos and her administration have actually put the FAFSA on a device, an iPhone, so you can fill it out there, and hopefully as we simplify it, you'll be able to look on your iPhone and see, well, if I borrow this, I'll owe this over this period of time, and people will make better informed decisions. But we are going to have to look at graduate loans because almost all of the big loans that are hard to pay back are graduate students, and we have to make a policy choice. I mean, do we want to loan an orthodontist that much money and not have it paid back? Probably not. We don't. On the other hand, at a hearing last week in our committee, we had testimony that the graduate medical education program, which forgives loans for doctors who practice in underserved areas, is the single best way to get primary care physicians into a rural area. Well, that's an important public policy decision too. But for most student loans, their average is $28,500, which for a 4-year college degree isn't easy to pay back, but is probably a better investment than your car loan, which is about the same average.
All right. I think we've got time for just a couple of quick questions, and we'll let the senator get on his way and get started on this bill. And so please say your name and where you're from, so we can. And we'll wait for a microphone before you start speaking. Back here, right there.
Hi, I'm Craig Linmore from the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. Please, the cost of graduate education came up. It's unfortunate that a real outlier in terms of those costs was raised. Unfortunately, some of the decisions that Congress has made relative to policy impacting graduate students has contributed to those increasing costs. For example, graduate students pay higher interest rates than undergraduate students. They've lost in-school interest subsidies, and they've also paid higher origination fees on their loans. So is it possible that Congress can reverse some of those trends and actually help lead to more affordability for graduate and professional students?
So you'd go the other way.
It's possible. I would start with the first priority is taking the available dollars we have and increasing the number of low-income students who can't afford the college to get their first 2 years or their 4 years, and put them in a position to get on the ladder and go up the ladder. Then when you get into graduate programs, some of which have to do with lawyers, which I am, or doctors or others, it's a lot of money to go to those schools. But the question is, should taxpayers, to what extent should taxpayers be subsidizing them as opposed to the low-income student who doesn't have a chance to get a Pell Grant? So I think it's a matter of priority. I'm willing to look at the graduate loans, particularly because there's so many of them that are so large, but that's because we have very generous programs, so that if you get your limit under this program, you can go over to this plus program, and if you go to the plus program, you can then go into the private market, and many people in graduate programs do that when perhaps they shouldn't borrow that much.
Another question? Here? Yes?
from the National Association of Scholars. I'm curious if you are interested in putting a cap on student loans. There's a lot of evidence that the availability of federal funding has driven up the cost of college. And so one way to put a damper on that is to just limit the amount of money that students can go into debt from the federal government.
Well, there is a cap on student loans now. You can only borrow a certain amount each year. And as I mentioned, the caps have resulted in an average of about $28,500. I would like to, for someone with a degree, I would like to the repayment plan that I suggested, my third proposal, which was a new accountability system to replace gainful employment, which would apply to every program at every school, should have the effect of discouraging higher tuition and encouraging lower tuition in programs where you're not likely to be able to earn enough to pay it back. So I'm looking for ways to put incentives into the system to discourage higher tuition rather than to encourage higher tuition.
Now, we have time, I think, for maybe just one more. Back here, all the way back.
Yes, my name is Steve Katsinas. I direct the Education Policy Center at the University of Alabama. We worked very closely with former Senator Cochran and Senator Shelby to reinstate Summer Pell with their outstanding staffs. And I thank you for your great service over the years to higher education. Two very quick questions. One is, you have steadfastly opposed maintenance of effort in the provisions, in part because of its concern for what it does to the states and flexibility. But I'm wondering if we're in the reverse case where we have kind of a reverse MOE by higher ed being the biggest piece of state government not to have maintenance of effort.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about that. And then the second thing is that do you anticipate, you wrote an op-ed about 10 years ago on a 3-year baccalaureate degree. With Summer Pell coming in, it seems to me that we're within striking distance of hitting that because we have a year-round student enrollment system that matches our foundational student aid system for the first time. So thank you.
Yeah, well, great questions. Let me take the first and the third question first on the Summer Pell and the 3-year degree. You know, we pride ourselves in that higher education is a market. And think about this. We've got 6,000 fairly autonomous institutions. Not autonomous as they'd like to be, but fairly autonomous institutions. We've got all this money following the students to the institution of their choice. Now, that's a voucher. Now, a lot of people don't like to hear me called a voucher, but all the federal student loans and all the Pell Grants are flat-out vouchers. So that ought to produce a market. And you would think that, therefore, higher education would act more like a market. But it acts less like a market than one would think. For example, people often pay more because they think if it costs more, it must be better, even though it's not better. It doesn't act like a market for a car. So I say that because the 3-year degree, which David Lipscomb in Nashville, a number of places around the country have tried, hadn't caught on like I thought it would. The Summer Pell Grant, which was a priority of mine and Senator Murray's, and as you mentioned, other senators, should make that easier and should meet my priority of giving priority aid to low-income Americans who can't afford to go to college. So the Summer Pell Grant is as important as simplifying the FAFSA. But I don't know why it doesn't encourage more 3-year degrees. The former president of George Washington University used to say that he was talking about the inefficiency of colleges, Trachtenberg. He said he could operate 2 universities on the George Washington University campus in the time that he had, given all the time everybody has off. That he could have 2 sets of faculty, 2 sets of students, and if that's true, why doesn't that happen somewhere? It just doesn't happen. So I'm puzzled, actually, at why the why our higher education system with autonomous institutions and this huge system of billions of dollars following students to the institution of their choice, which ought to be the definition of a market, why it doesn't act more like one. But I'm hopeful the Pell Grant and the demand for education will help. One other thing, I'm giving too long an answer, the competency-based education that I mentioned several senators who are interested in that, and Walter Russell Mead says that so you measure not how long they're sitting in the seat, but whether they're learning anything. That could help because we give out our federal money based primarily upon how long you're sitting in your seat, not whether when you arrive at the technical institute you already know 50% of what it takes to be a welder, and you can learn the rest of it in 6 or 8 months. Senator Kaine, for example, has talked about shorter-term Pell Grants, competency-based education. That might help make our institutions more of a market in the world in which we live today.
Well, this being AI, I feel like we should leave it on a markets note. So everybody stay put. We're going to switch to a panel, but it will take just a couple of minutes. But for now, join me in thanking Senator Alexander. They should flip them on. Here we go. All right, we're back. So I'm going to turn this over to Erica Green, a reporter at the New York Times who covers education, so she can moderate a discussion. There's sort of a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. So, and I'll let Erica introduce the panelists as well.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I am Erica Green, education reporter at the New York Times, and I'm joined today by Jason Delisle, a resident fellow at AEI, Lene Erickson, a senior vice president for social policy and politics at Third Way. Make sure I have everyone in the correct order. Sarah Flanagan, the vice president for government relations and policy development at the National Association of Independent Colleges, and Michelle Asha Cooper, the president of the Institute for Higher Education Policy. So if we could give them a round of applause, thank you for coming. Okay, so we just heard a lot, still digesting a bit, but I think I want to open it up pretty generally to get the conversation going, and ask you all, what you heard from the senator, the good, the bad, and what could get ugly. So you want to start, Jason, or Michelle? Either end.
I've already cashed in my chits as the host here and taken the first question.
Sure.
So go ahead.
Okay. So thank you for bringing us together, Jason and AEI. Certainly, it was great to hear Senator Alexander talk about his commitments related to higher education. It is encouraging to hear that higher education is a priority for his team and others in the Senate, and that they have already been working and planning to ensure that we are able to offer this Christmas gift, as he called it, to American students. I heard three kind of categories. I heard details related to simplification proposals that Senator Alexander has been discussing and talking about for quite some time. I also heard about bipartisan legislation that is already circulating on the Hill that seems very encouraging and likely to be present in some type of reauthorization bill or conversations at the least. And I heard a concern about today's students. So just to briefly give some sort of feedback on those three categories. In terms of the simplification details, I think for my colleagues and I at the Institute for Higher Education Policy, we certainly would say that Senator Alexander's goals of simplification certainly kind of dovetails with some of our priorities related to affordability and data transparency. Certainly, we also would agree that the financial aid process could be much simpler. We also think that financial aid award letters could be much more clear and transparent. For example, making sure all students understand common terminology, that they know that what's a grant versus what's a loan before they take on these amounts of debt, as he mentioned. Also, we see lots of potential related to simplification around eliminating questions, such as question 23, which has absolutely nothing to do with financial aid eligibility, but because it asks people about their prior history with the criminal justice system. Absolutely nothing to do with financial aid. So those are just some real areas that we could see simplification in terms of the form. Also, the process could be simpler for those who are the neediest by increasing the automatic zero EFC. So we already have that threshold in place, but we had it at one level and then we decreased it in 2012, but I see we should bring it back up to $34,000, allowing students whose family income is $34,000 at a minimum should qualify for a maximum Pell Grant. And I think that's a very simple message and a simple thing to do. Also, there were some things related to bipartisan legislation that has been circulating that I'm excited to hear about. Certainly the College Transparency Act, which is around data transparency and ensuring that we use the data that we already have available, either being reported to the federal government or other federal agencies beyond the Department of Education, using that data to talk better and to be very explicit about student outcomes, student level outcomes. That is really encouraging, and it's certainly something that I would love to see move forward in the Higher Education Act. And also, as I mentioned earlier, about working and doing more to help those who have been previously and currently incarcerated, reinstating the Pell Grants for those who seek higher education through the criminal justice system, I think is an easy win and something that could help those who are directly impacted, but also our society overall. And my third thing that I just would mention is Senator Alexander's expression of concern for today's students. It was really heartening to hear him talk about today's students and wanting to do more and work with his colleagues to support these students. And he even talked about the growth that we have witnessed in the higher education system over the last several decades. And I think it's really important to just put a real finer point on that growth. Since 1990, we have increased our enrollment by 5 million students, which has been exclusively driven by people of color. And we need to use this HEA reauthorization as a moment to really take a look at our policies and our priorities and ensure that we are thinking about equity-minded policies that are addressing the needs of who today's students really are. And that is not to the exclusion of anyone, because I think that we can do this in such a way where everyone wins and everyone benefits, and that we really use it as an opportunity to shine a light on our post-secondary policies and address deep-seated inequities that are inherent and run rampant in our system.
I want to take a step back, especially since you ended with concern for students. I was hoping someone could give us some context, right? You know, student loan debt has become a very scary term recently. I mean, it used to be, at least when I was in college, which was not that long ago. But you know, it used to be that student loan debt was a part of the process. It was like avocado; it was good fat, right? There's good debt, there's good fat, and That's right. And now it's like, you know, it's a really it's unnecessary, it's burdensome, and to a student, at least where I'm from in Baltimore, it could be really scary. It could be a deterrent. I know. Part of that is just, you know, we're under a Republican administration. We don't want to see spending go up and want to take care of taxpayers. But when did this become a crisis? I think that would be helpful to just set the tone.
Well, I'll just say I think politically it's become a crisis because it's the people that voters, it's the voters that speak up, and it's the people that politicians hear from. So when Hillary Clinton was running, she would have the person that says, I have $100,000 in loans standing next to her, and I graduated from Harvard Medical School. And that person is not who I'm worried about, and that is not the person that our HEA should be worried about. That person's going to be fine. So I think we really have kind of defined the problem within higher ed, at least in popular culture and with folks who aren't paying that close of attention to higher ed in the wrong way if we start with loans. And I'll just say, you know, I'll take Senator Alexander's advice about telling a story. So he talked about Joe, the engineering graduate who couldn't repay his loans. I think Joe, with an engineering degree, is probably going to be fine. But here's actually what happens to Joe. Joe, with Senator Alexander's proposals, gets to fill out his FAFSA form. He does it much quicker. He's like, great, I did that in 20 minutes. That's awesome. My form is shorter. Then he goes to a school where he's more likely to default on his loans than he is to graduate, because that is what he has access to in his area, or that's what he's heard about on TV. And he doesn't actually have any guarantee that the place that he's going is going to in any way serve him or make sure that he actually gets that degree. And in our system right now, 1 in 2 students that are signing up and having access to college are dropping out. And at some places we're sending huge loan checks to and huge taxpayer checks to, it's 9 in 10 are dropping out at Joe's school. So if we're not addressing that major problem within the higher education system, and I don't hear anything that Senator Alexander was really putting on the table to do that, I think we're really acting to the detriment of students.
Well, I'll just add that, you know, certainly as Lanae pointed out, leaving college without a degree is really bad. Leaving college without a degree and a lot of debt is even worse.
That's right.
But I think when we often talk about the conversation about student debt, we place our emphasis on things we can do at the back end. And I think we need to start focusing on things we can do at the front end, which has a lot to do with college costs and tuition prices.
Great segue into what we all really want to talk about, which is gainful employment for all, apparently. So the proposal around accountability for institutions and program level data, and making that accessible to everyone and making it available for every institution in the country. Would love to get all of your thoughts on how that's going to be received in various sectors of higher education, and whether you think we're, it's time for that.
Yeah, I think that what you heard Senator Alexander say was something about doing something based on loans. He wants to do something based on whether or not people pay back their loans. which I actually, if he were still here, I would urge him to think beyond loans in thinking about accountability and whether or not college is worth it. I think we're really hung up on loans as the way to do this. But he mentioned a $28 billion Pell Grant program, which would be outside of the scope of a system that is based on whether or not you pay back your loans. But I think that, I think he's trying to get at something that is a little bit more robust than what we currently have, this sort of easily gamed student loan cohort default rate, where you can just simply enter a plan where you don't have to pay, and it looks like you're doing great. So, I think there's progress on that front, and I think there's bipartisan interest in making that a little bit stronger.
Well, and I certainly agree with the senator that we need to have more accountability in the system and actually hold institutions responsible for the outcomes of the students they're enrolling. But if you think about his kind of piecemeal proposals taken together, he also suggested a more robust and simplified income-based repayment. And if you count those outcomes, as they did say in the Prosper Act, as positive repayment, then you actually end up with no accountability, because you're going to have everybody be in that repayment program, and you're not going to have anybody who's not repaying their loans, even if they're not actually paying down $1 of their principal. So I think the devil's in the details about this particular piece, but it goes back to this idea that we've got big problems within our higher education system, and just kind of stapling together existing bills that might have bipartisan support just isn't going to be sufficient to handle them.
So I think you're right that the most controversial area will be this gainful employment for all, as it's been sort of spun out or thought about. So first I want to think about gainful employment as it's been known and why it only applies to the programs it applies to. And it's because those programs are the job training programs of the Higher Education Act, right? So the metric, whether the metric's right or not, as we've known it, the idea is, well, if you're going to go and get a job training program, it ought to add enough money to your salary, if it's just job training, to be able to pay back the loan to which you borrowed it, right? So the metric is a 3-year outlook, 3 years after you finish. It's not an outlook for larger education, a bachelor's degree, where if you look at the trends, and we think of the earnings as a byproduct of a good education, but not the core mission of colleges and universities, that we need to ensure that we don't give up quality in an effort to, make sure you earn more money 3 years out. But if you look at the trajectory of when people earn more, it is further out. It is not the 3-year window of a job training program. Job training, you often go up fast and then it flattens for the rest of your life. And that's one of the concerns with job training. But having said that, when you talk to our colleges and universities, I represent, I think it's 967 private nonprofit colleges and universities. It's a broad array of institutions. But when you look at what our members look at, it's not the accountability. We keep on getting told by everybody who puts this forward, oh, don't worry, we looked at the numbers, all your programs are going to pass. And but it's on one hand, it's the red tape, okay? I mean, there's, by our estimate, we can't remember how many millions of majors we came up with, and innovation. I mean, majors are changing all the time. If an institution isn't changing their majors right now to answer this need by students, they're not going to survive. But the real concern that they have is, what does this look like for equity on campus? Imagine if it worked exactly the way that Senator Alexander imagined it. Then you're going to end up with, okay, English majors are not making as much 3 years out. I was a humanities major. I don't even think I could get a full-time waitressing job 3 years out. That might have been when I was a bus tour operator, being paid as a migrant worker. Anyway, okay, so we're gonna charge you as a humanities major $10,000 a year, and if you want to go into engineering, we're going to charge you $50,000 a year in this scenario. Where do you think low-income students are going to get pushed? They're going to get pushed into these $10,000 a year, and even if they want to be an engineer. Or as someone said to me, well, if you want to be a political science major, but you're going to make more in math, I would have been a terrible math major. I was actually pretty good in math, but I hated it, okay? So this idea that we're going to give now opportunity for education and what you major in and the choice you make based on whether or not you're wealthy or poor. Most of our colleges said they'd shut down. I mean, they just, that is so, you know, we don't price by major. We don't price in that way by cost because we want students to have choice. So this is one of the most, and that's not why Senator Alexander's proposing it. That's not why he's proposing it. But when we look at the outcomes of what it would have for equity and choice on campus, we're alarmed about this. And not for the reasons that, you know, it's not that we're not willing to be accountable. And what he's trying to also do is, remember, if you look at his loan thing, you get rid of loan defaults. So he's trying to come up with an alternative to a loan default measure. But maybe what was suggested, we ought to look more broadly beyond loans and try to think of a different accountability mechanism that really makes sense.
Why do you think he's going to, say more about that, how he's going to get rid of loan defaults?
Well, there are no more defaults.
If everyone repays.
Because everybody is, if you're making too little, you don't owe money, you're never defaulting, which I think was your point about there would be no more loan defaults. There's
It's quite
no
an
such thing
assumption.
as a defaulter.
I mean, that's quite an assumption.
Well, it certainly would come
Under
true.
the formula as he put it forward.
And it certainly would come true if we held institutions accountable for that repayment rate then, and what they could do to get out of that accountability was make sure all of their students were enrolled in that program. We've already seen schools are very, very good at skirting the cohort default rate. Schools that are kind of bad actors are good at that, and so they would game this too, this time by maybe not hurting students as badly because they're putting them in a income-based repayment plan, but they're not going to be held accountable.
So one of the pieces that he didn't mention today that I was told was that it would basically come out of your paycheck. So it would be automatic.
Yeah.
He did mention that.
So if you earn,
it would be automatic, so you wouldn't have a default anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, I have real issues with this sort of the automatic argument that I think he's making here. I think this is one of the problems is I think it's hard to make it automatic, right? So let's just play this out, right? I show up to the American Enterprise Institute for my first day of work. How does American Enterprise Institute know to take money out of my paycheck for my student loan? How would they possibly? The only way it could be automatic, right? Is
Data match.
Right? They wouldn't know this, right? They wouldn't know I have a student loan unless I told them. So now we're not automatic, right out of the gate here. So I think there's some things that need to be worked out in this bill about how to make something like that automatic.
Well, you're going to do it on the front end when you download on your FAFSA and you get rid of those questions. You're going to be put into. You're going to give them permission to go into your into your tax records and your Social Security payment. So they will know the first time when you bring your Social Security card to AEI, they're going to go and get tap into your student loan record, I think, right?
So AEI will log in and say, oh, we see that, Jason, you have a student loan. And then they'll start withholding.
I told you it's complicated.
Well, look, I think someone already
when
said the devil is in the details for sure. I think the broader issue is we want to make sure that all students have access to a high-quality education. Like, that's really our goal, and I think the first step to do that is greater transparency about quality, price, and outcomes. And we can't do that until we have better data and use that data to help really drive institutional improvement.
And Michelle, I'm interested. Do you think if institutions started to price programs at different levels, that would create inequities?
Well, that's not something I've really studied, so I don't want to talk about something I don't know.
Okay.
But I think we have to get institutions, institutional leaders, and all of us really in the mindset of recognizing that the data that we have can be better and that we can make better use out of it. And I think that's sort of ground zero for any type of quality enhancement by really getting a handle on the data. And certainly, as Senator Alexander talked about, there are pieces of legislation already floating, College Transparency Act to be one of them, that would be designed to do precisely that.
But,
well, we may see it sooner rather than later because we may have the gainful employment rates by program. We're waiting for them any day because colleges have been reporting by zip code. This will be for the student aid recipients. They have been reporting, and then they're going to do these data matches. And one thing that came out of the new gainful employment kind of pullback that the DeVos administration did is that they have proposed that they make it a transparency piece and they're going to put it on the college scorecard. So we're waiting for this to appear any day. We may start to know what a policy like this would look like.
Well, and I think, Sarah's point was well taken that any change you make is going to have ripple effects throughout the system. And so you have to actually think about this in a wholesale way. And that's where I just, while I agree that we should be focused on, return on investment and that there's huge bipartisan opportunity, the HEA is a bill you do once every 10 years. Why would we start with a bunch of small ball bills? We're just tinkering around the edges and saying, oh, well, that looks easier, let's do that. I don't think that that's actually serving students particularly well. And I think at this moment, there's actually real opportunity to do something much bigger that tackles some of the affordability issues, that tackles some of the quality issues we've raised, and that would much better serve students than, kind of going down a tick list of the Democratic senators and trying to pull each one off with some kind of bill that they already have.
Can we just talk briefly about red tape? What does that mean? What is the red tape? And is it for students? Is it for
So
institutions?
on this particular proposal, I forgot how many millions of majors that we estimated on the back of the envelope. So if you take it at face value that supposedly our institutions in general are going to do okay, think about millions of majors, because each institution, however many they have, I don't know how you're going to take a new major. A lot of institutions, for example, are taking their liberal arts programs and they're incorporating and blending them with career development so that people understand almost what kind of a career I could do with. Criminal justice is a perfect one. Okay, there are criminal justice majors all over the place post 9/11. So we're going to have this major by major, separate pricing, separate analysis. I mean, this whole project that we gratefully worked with Senator Alexander on to look at some of the regulations we might not need anymore that he has been. I mean, the gains that could be made on lowering cost on that or lowering expenses on that pales in comparison to this kind of down at the academic level of looking at former students. I mean, it's extraordinarily new. I mean, it really gets to the heart of higher ed. So that's the red tape.
Because you would have to report to the Department of Education.
But we already do that.
Which the program that every student is in, but you already do that.
We do that.
So that isn't a new thing that you would have to do, though.
Right, but now you're going to make eligibility for student aid for each major different based on, I mean, the other problem is you're going to lose your eligibility. So the idea is that, okay, well, if a student if my English major, I keep on picking on poor English majors, but if my English major. Okay, see, so you're doing fine. But English,
I feel like we usually use feminist studies or something like that. As a Mount Holyoke graduate, I feel like we should use feminist
studies graduates didn't make enough in this cohort. So now the students aren't eligible anymore. I got to shut down the major. I guess I got to shut down the major. How do I regain eligibility? Even if I did what they wanted.
You can lower the price.
You can lower the price.
Yeah.
But I can't because I'm there. I can't even lower it to half price for a student who has to borrow a loan because that major is no longer eligible for Title IV eligibility. Do you see how it's a chicken and egg problem?
Well, you have a few years to see it.
You do?
Right? You can sort of see this
happening. I don't know,
right?
do we?
So
we're going to have quite a few years.
But I think this is one of the super interesting things.
So this is the kind of red tape, right? So now we're going to need a few years to get it back on, and how many years do we have? And what happens to the three majors? What do you do with the cohorts in most of our institutions of less than 10? Do they just get a free ride if you're at a, why don't we just then make 50 majors? 3 students in every major. I mean, it just, the whole way of that, I'm just giving you the red tape answer, right? As you start to imagine this.
Well, I think this is one of the interesting things that I didn't hear Senator Alexander talk a lot about today, but that he's talked about in the past is kind of program level accountability versus institutional level accountability. And program level accountability, I think, is a super interesting idea because particularly for those career education programs that gainful employment applies to, there's really different outcomes depending on the program that you're in. So shouldn't you kind of be able to tell that, and also you should have the data to know that before you make a choice to get in, and also it might it might actually incentivize institutions to close down bad programs instead of kind of being completely cut off from Title IV. But a lot of this is experimental, and not all things should be at the program level, right? Because how are you supposed to capture someone who enrolls in one semester of liberal arts education or a associate's degree and then drops out?
Capture them with red tape.
Or switches majors.
Yeah, exactly.
Switches majors.
Right, or switches majors. The students aren't robots. They're moving around in and out of the system. And so I think that's why you have to kind of think about pairing institutional level accountability where it makes sense, particularly to capture those 50% of people that aren't even graduating, and then program level accountability on another side.
So in case I didn't translate this because we weren't sure, we had to go back to the Hill and ask last year when this idea, by program, do you mean major by major? Or do you mean liberal arts, for example, at a traditional? And they said, no, major by major. So I just want to clarify that in case that wasn't instantly obvious why I was going to this level.
Question.
Okay, we are going to open the floor up for questions. We have a mic coming around. If you could just say your name and where you're from. Nobody?
That would be a first.
Hi, my name's Paul Haga. I'm from NPR, but I'm not reporting anything. I'm the board chair, and I'm a retired mutual fund lawyer, so don't worry about me. But since we're at AEI, is it possible to conclude that maybe some of these cures are worse than the disease, and that we kind of step back and just think that many times federal micromanagement of a situation leads you to something where you opine for the original disease? And I'll just suggest one, 1984 Tax Act tried to solve the crushing issue of a few CEOs making over $1 million, and the cure was to tie it to stock prices and launch the salaries to the moon. So maybe we can just sort of think, okay, how bad is this, and is it really worth a federal micromanagement solution?
Well, as a taxpayer who's paying part of the $130 billion that's already going to institutions for higher ed, I'd say it's a big problem when half of students don't graduate. And it's not as if we're actually talking about enforcing the federal government on top of that. We're paying for it already. And we should be able to get something for those huge checks. I mean, when you look at the amount that we ask back from schools at the K-12 level versus what we ask from schools here, where, as Senator Alexander said, it's basically a voucher, go with God, and I hope you do well. That's really not, I don't think, setting our students up for success. There's no guardrails to make sure that our tax dollars are only going to places that are actually going to help them.
But higher ed is not funded exclusively or even primarily through the federal student aid programs. And I think it's a really good question. And I do think we need to think about what kind of a higher ed system do we want. I would be one who would argue that the model of No Child Left Behind and the kinds of the way that the federal government tried to leverage, I think it's 7% at the time, right, of K-12 funding, was not successful. It undermined the teaching profession, among many, many other things. And I hope we don't go there with higher education, because we do have a lot right. And I think it is good to put that on the table. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be accountable to the money. I'm not saying, but I hope we don't lose our focus on low-income students or some of the really good things we could accomplish. Like, it's going to cost more if it's easier to fill out the FAFSA, because guess what? More low-income people are going to go to college. And when low-income people go to college, they face all kinds of risks that wealthy students don't face, even if college is free for them, okay? And I don't think we can lose that concept either. I was talking to one college president, and we asked the question, what are some, high percentage of Pell students, so what are the reasons your students are dropping out? Some of it is academic preparation. Some of it, I'm sure, is not enough support service at the institution. But one of the things that they said to me that was really, really interesting, and a lot of it is finance. I get it through 2 years, I can't get them to 3. One of the really interesting things was, well, one of the biggest causes is that we have a lot of women, this is a women's college president, and they get called back home to be the health care provider in their family when grandma gets sick. They all live together, and one of the biggest problems we have is an illness in the family. to lack of continuation. So how do we measure all this? I mean, there are some. We cannot lose the fact that if the federal government is trying to partner with colleges and so many other people, taxpayers, students, to try and make access for students who wouldn't otherwise have it because of financial means, I don't want to lose the focus on the real life obstacles. We're talking about foster care children in this, kids who don't have anywhere to go over Christmas. I mean, I just don't want to lose in our rev up to get to make sure that everybody's, that colleges are accountable and everything. I think we have a pretty good system, and I don't want to lose that focus on there are so many obstacles that we can't lose the core reason for the Higher Education Act that came out of the war on poverty. And those obstacles, that conversation can lead to a different set of solutions than a big one about what's wrong and what's right with American higher education.
And I would just want to add to that point that, I think sometimes why it might feel like the cure is worse than the disease, I think that's how you've said it, is because there's a disconnect between these policies and the people that they are intended to serve now. I'm taking it back to who today's students are. So if the policies are not really targeted towards low-income students, towards students of color and other marginalized students, such as those who are incarcerated, who are representing the vast majority of our students today, that's why you get that sense, because we're not really connecting the dots. And I really see that this opportunity with HEA, there seems to be great enthusiasm from the folks with Senator Chair Alexander and himself. He's also very enthusiastic to do this. And I share that enthusiasm, but I hope that we take a moment to make sure that we're really connecting the dots between what the policy is intended to do, should do, and is it really having an impact on the students who are in our college classrooms today.
Hi, this is Sarah Mancall with the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, SPISSY we're known as. I had a question about kind of taking a life course perspective since I was a human development major. As people are graduating from college with debt, they're also starting their childbearing years, and they're also looking to buy that first home. And if we're thinking about the economic costs and the social costs and the psychological costs of student debt, can you all speak a little bit more to some of the front-end solutions so that maybe we're just talking about debt less and some other solution?
Well, this goes back to Erica's point at the beginning about what's wrong with student debt, right?
No, when did it become terrifying?
When did it become not the good fact?
That's good.
Right, this is supposed to be an investment, and I think that for the vast majority of people, it is a good one, and it is one that pays off. So it does make sense to use loans to finance higher education this way, and particularly since people are going to go on and get higher earnings, and so they should pay something back. But I think that the issue of addressing inability to repay, and what you were mentioning sounded like a temporary inability to repay, is already addressed in the existing set of income-based repayment plans that we have for the student loan program. Now, I think the problem is, do you need to forgive $50,000 in graduate school debt to solve that problem that you're talking about? No, I don't think so. I don't think those things have to go together, and I think we should start separating them.
But another front-end solution would be to make sure that certain programs aren't asking you to take out a level of debt that you're never going to be able to repay because it doesn't actually give you any ability to earn in the market. And that's what the gainful employment regulations attempted to do, is say debt to earnings. If you're about to take out, $100,000 worth of loans to go to a nursing program that you're going to get paid an average of $30,000 a year, maybe that's not a good idea. And so I think, saying gainful for all is a great bumper sticker. I like it, but what Senator Alexander has proposed doesn't actually do the same level of accountability that the current gainful does now. And I think you're going to see Democrats saying, listen, we're not about to create a new, pot of money for for-profits in short-term Pell that has no kind of guardrails around it and get rid of gainful. That's not a deal that Democrats are willing to make, regardless of whether certain Democrats support each of those kinds of bills as a separate measure. So I do think that's kind of the other piece that you have to think about. We've got a Democratic House. we've got a lot of Democrats in the Senate that are going to need to vote for this, and you just simply can't say, okay, well, I wrote this bill with, Senator Jones, so we're all good. That's not how we're going to get a bill to Trump's desk.
For the record, before I get a phone call from the senator's office, I branded it Gainful for All. He did not. His is a little more nuanced than that, so. Sorry, next question.
I like Gainful for All. I'm for Gainful for All. I'm just not for gutting it and then not replacing it with anything.
Good afternoon. Kimberly Jones with the Council for Opportunity and Education. Really appreciate this afternoon's conversation. Even though Senator Alexander focused his comments around financial aid, campus safety, and gainful employment, there are a lot of other parts of the Higher Education Act that weren't addressed. So I'm wondering if you have any forecasts on teacher prep, minority serving institutions, and other parts of HEA as we move forward.
Well, we certainly know that Representative Scott, who's the chair in the House of the Education Committee, is a strong proponent of many things, but he has a particular commitment to HBCUs and MSIs and Hispanic serving institutions. He also wants to ensure that there's a pathway. He understands that a bachelor's degree is the transformative degree for a first-generation college student, and he wants to ensure that that pathway continues. So I think you'll see, we've already seen in his legislation strong commitments to that. I know that the legislation they have out there on the House side is a little bit of a cut and paste on the Democratic side last year when the Prosper Act was moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see where they go. They're trying to also find a bipartisan process. They're going to start hearings, but I certainly cannot imagine that that Chairman Scott would let a bill go through. He said quite clearly he will not let a bill go through that doesn't keep those institutions and populations in the forefront.
And I think investing in institutions and in higher ed generally is something that the Democrats care a lot about. They care about affordability, and they are looking at things like state and federal partnerships. And Senator Alexander talked about opposing maintenance of effort. Well, we're just seeing states divest and divest and divest, and then we're making students take out more and more and more in loans, and particularly the students we care the most about and should care about. So I think there will be a lot of affordability conversations on the table. And then a lot of the Democrats that I'm talking to are very concerned about Secretary DeVos's agenda to kind of tear up accreditation and say you can 100% outsource something to Trump University or whoever else. And that's just a total non-starter. So I think you're going to see a lot of focus on that, and on, especially if we're not going to have gainful employment anymore, what we're going to do to make sure predatory institutions aren't taking advantage of low-income students.
I have a question.
So it will not be simple.
That's right.
So say Congress does deliver another Christmas miracle at the end of the year, which is the goal, which is the stated goal from the senator. What's the greatest gift that they can give students in this country pursuing a higher education degree?
Go down the list.
Doesn't matter to me.
I would say that the greatest gift will be focused on Pell Grants, making sure that Pell Grants are indexed to inflation, that we're restoring the purchasing power of them, that we are reinstating, we are relifting the ban for those who are incarcerated, and that we are, I would also say, adding to the available amount of money available to Pell. I think that'd be a great gift. I'd be really happy
to get that gift. Yeah.
I will second that. I will take that gift as well.
I mean, that sounds good to me. I would also want to make sure that institutions are going to be held more accountable for whether they're delivering for students, and making sure that any changes we're making are actually focused on equity and focused on helping low-income students and students of color, because, as Sarah mentioned, that was the reason for the Higher Education Act in the first place.
I think the greatest gift that the Congress could give to undergraduates would be to stop subsidizing graduate students so much and move some of that money over to helping people get their first degree, rather than their next one.
Subsidize.
Jason, you should
They
stop
don't
being so
subsidize it at
critical.
all.
That was very.
They don't subsidize. The graduate students pay in. They help support the undergrads.
He's worried about his
Whole other
orthodontist.
panel.
That's what he's worried about.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks for joining us. We're only a minute over. Thanks so much. Great.
Thank you.
And this evening, Senate Democratic Whip Dick Durbin of Illinois will talk about the Senate Democratic agenda leading up to 2020. Live from Georgetown University at 7 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. And later this week, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker will testify on the special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Live from the House Judiciary Committee Friday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2. This week on The Communicators, a technology update with Assistant Attorney General Makin Del-Rahim, Rhode Island Democratic Representative Jim Langevin, and Corey Thomas, CEO of cybersecurity company Rapid7.
Recently, you would have heard Sprint and T-Mobile merging. We're reviewing that, or AT&T, Time Warner, Disney and Fox. So those are mergers that go through us, and we determine whether or not they violate the antitrust laws by reducing competition in certain markets.
The thing that worries me the most also is how do we better protect critical infrastructure? Because that's where the most damage can be done. You think of the damage that can be done to our electric grid or hospital systems, our banking system. So there are major things that are in place to protect us. But the attack surface is so broad that we need to continue to strengthen the public-private partnership going forward to make sure that we are better protected.
We've deployed technology that provides lots of increased capability, lots of functionality, but we also got less resilient because now a single issue can actually cause widespread disruption. And that's what we're grappling with as new sectors of the economy adopt technology.
Join us tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Over the last year, the world has seen what we always knew, that no people on earth are so fearless or daring or determined as Americans. If there is a mountain, we climb it. If there's a frontier, we cross it. If there's a challenge, we tame it. If there's an opportunity, we seize it. So let's begin tonight by recognizing that the state of our union is strong because our people are strong.
The State of the Union, first postponed because of the government shutdown, will now take place on Tuesday night. Watch as President Trump delivers his State of the Union address live from the House chamber, beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, followed by the Democratic response by former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. The State of the Union, live Tuesday at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN, cspan.org, or listen with the free C-SPAN radio app.
Each week in this segment of the Washington Journal, we take a look at how your money is at work in government programs. And this week, we're focusing on state governments and this topic of teacher pay. Joining us for this conversation, Daryl Burnett, state policy reporter at Education Week, author of a recent story about K-12 spending in states, noting that it's been on the rise since the Great Recession, but that hasn't necessarily translated into higher salaries for teachers. Why is that?
Well, especially at the state level, governors are really quick to say, hey, we want to give money to districts to give teachers pay raises. But what actually is happening is that districts, both superintendents, school board members, and unions are the ones that are actually in charge of how this money gets dispersed. And so what ends up happening is a lot of districts have other priorities that they want to pay for, such as reducing class sizes, such as maybe purchasing laptop computers for all the students, that they would like to spend rather than actually giving teacher pay raises. I mean, teacher pay raises is a very expensive cost that has a compounding effect over years. So unless they are getting, hundreds of millions of dollars more from the state, it's a difficult task.
We'll talk about some of those compounding effects, but since it is our Your Money segment, some numbers to start us off this morning. States spent $294.8 billion on K-12 education. Here's some of the numbers when it comes to teacher pay. This from 2016 to 17 school year. The numbers from the National Education Association. The average teacher salary about $59,660, higher in some states, of course. New York, about $82,000 a year. California, $79,000 a year. In West Virginia, the average public school teacher salary, $45,000 a year. Mississippi, almost $43,000 a year. Viewers and us on the Washington Journal have talked quite a bit about some of the protests involving teacher pay around the country. Remind us of some of the big ones in recent weeks.
Yeah, I mean, some of the big ones, LA, Denver. Last year we had entire statewide protests in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona. These protests, which actually is getting a lot of parental support, can shut down schools for a week and a half at a time. That causes all kinds of problems for parents, et cetera. But the pressure is actually effective. And a lot of governors are actually saying, okay, we want to give you some more money. But one of the things that we've been saying is that the governors will say, yes, we're going to give more money, but what ends up happening is that the teachers aren't. And this is actually happening in some of the states that actually gave more money last year. So Arizona, Washington State, in which they gave billion-dollar pay raises, what they call pay raises for teachers. And what ended up happening this year was some teachers got 5% pay raises, some teachers got 18% pay raises. In some districts around Tacoma, Washington area, they got 0% raises. So it just caused a lot of headaches.
Focus on Arizona for a second, right, and what specifically happened there and why.
So Arizona, there was a week and a half strike. Teachers were upset about some of the low pay there. I mean, we talk about averages, but we've talked to teachers there that are making $30,000 a year. I mean, very, very low pay. And that state has a huge teacher shortage there too. So the governor at first said, no, Doug Ducey, he really wants to cut taxes. He was saying, no, I don't want to give teachers a raise after a lot of pressure. He said, okay, I'm going to give teachers a 20% pay raise by 2020. But in Arizona, like in the vast majority of states, districts actually decide how to spend money. So you put that money in districts' general funds. And when it went to negotiations, some teachers said, okay, or some districts said, okay, we will give that money to you guys, and we'll give you guys a 10% pay raise, which, as the governor said, was going to be the average this year. But in a lot of states, a lot of districts in Arizona, there were some districts that were like, no, we want custodians to get pay raise too, or we want to reduce class sizes, or we want to hire more teachers. All these sorts of competing pressures for districts. And some teachers ended up getting very little pay raise. And so teachers there are actually still pretty upset. They're still threatening a strike this year if there's not going to be more pay raises or more money given to the districts. And a lot of people are saying too that it actually does not address what's at the crux of Arizona's issues, which is a widespread teacher shortage, especially in some of the rural areas of that state.
We want to hear what's happening in your state, in your part of the country, as we focus on teacher pay in this Your Money segment of the Washington Journal. Phone line's a little bit different this morning. If you are a teacher, 202-748-8000 is the number. School administrators, 202-748-8001. Parents, 202-748-8002. Or just call us on our All Others line, 202-748-8003. Want to hear from you as we're having this discussion until the bottom of the hour this morning. We're talking with Daryl Burnett of Education Week, state policy reporter. And in some of your reportings, you went out and talked to some of these superintendents to try to look into some of these reasons why the money doesn't actually get to teachers to increase their pay. Talk about the idea of backfilling positions and the concerns about spending the money there versus on the teachers who actually have jobs.
Yeah, so the recession wasn't that long ago, about 10 years ago, and during the recession, school districts were affected probably the most. They froze hiring. They laid off all kinds of secretaries, janitors. They laid off, IT folks, central office staff. A lot of districts ended up laying off teachers. It was a pretty devastating several years for districts. And so what's happening is that now that states actually have surpluses, they're starting to provide schools more money. It's still not to pre-recession levels, but districts are trying to backfill all the positions that they laid off. So instead of giving across the board pay raises, they're trying to basically build back the structure that they had before the recession. I mean, I've talked to districts that are, there's basically 1 or 2 people in their central office. There's, only like 1 person, sometimes 0 people collecting data. I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting about the teacher strikes is a lot of teachers are saying, a lot of these protests, especially in LA and Arizona was like this too, Oklahoma, in which they were saying, hey, not only do we want a bigger pay increase for teachers, but we also want to hire more nurses, hire more school psychologists, hire more speech pathologists, all the people that parents are saying are crucial to making schools the sort of effective institutions that they've always been historically.
Another competing pressure point that you talk about is the obligations that school districts have for teachers, pensions, and other benefits. Can you talk through some of those?
Yeah, so states right now, there's a $516 billion pension debt. I mean, this is promises that districts made to teachers. This says, once you retire, we're going to give you certain benefits. It's one of the reasons why many teachers actually get into the teaching business. They call it the social contract. That pension debt is coming home to roost right now, and districts are having to pay down this debt in order to avoid bankruptcy. So what we saw in California, which is where the state has been giving billions of dollars, some of the largest increases in the entire country in the last couple of years, but they also told districts, you need to pay down these pension costs. And so when districts are deciding whether or not to give pay raises or to pay down their pension costs, I'd rather go bankrupt than satisfy some teachers who are asking for a pay raise.
Let's hear from some teachers. Sue is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Good morning.
Good morning. I just really appreciate your guest today. And I'm a music teacher. I taught at fancy private schools in South Florida. But the problem with private schools was that the parents call the shots. And then when I moved back to New Mexico, I could not get hired in a public school. And when I wanted to go and get recertified, it was going to start at $32,000 a year. And what would be the point of that? It's not enough money. And I just think we need to really invest in education. And Betsy DeVos needs to go.
Gerald Burnett.
That's interesting that she's calling from New Mexico. New Mexico is one of the 17 states that actually does have a statewide pay scale, and the new governor there, she's proposing a large increase. What a lot of folks are saying will not actually fix a teacher shortage in New Mexico. This is a huge problem that districts are having. I've talked to superintendents who are saying that I'm losing applicants to Walmart. I'm losing applicants to the local private industry because we just cannot compete. We can't give the benefit packages. We cannot give the sorts of salaries that can compete with the private industry here. And so what ends up happening is the districts are having to decide whether we lower our requirements in order to become a teacher, or we sweeten up the pot for teachers. But as a lot of callers I'm sure will attest, teaching is not easy. In New Mexico, there are some districts in which I've talked to superintendents there that are doing driving the bus, they're teaching, they're the principal, they're collecting data, they're reporting to parents. There's a lot of pressures on teachers, there's a lot of pressure on administrators, and they're just not getting paid for what a conscionable citizen would say, yeah, I'll take that job. It's just a very hard sell.
You said a statewide pay scale in New Mexico is somewhat unique?
It's a very unique thing.
Why is that?
Only 17 states actually do this. I mean, this is a staple of American education. It's one of the unique things that we have versus other Western countries in which we think that decisions should be made locally. So because of that, we have given a lot of powers to local school boards and superintendents in order to make a lot of decisions as to how they spend their money. So the difference between when we made those decisions back, in the birthplace, the early days of America when we decided, hey, local should be a local decision. The difference today is that states are spending a large portion of districts of education dollars. So they're spending, 45%, 46%. In some states, they're actually paying for the vast majority of education costs. So what you're seeing is that you're having governors and legislatures who are providing the cost for education, and local officials actually making the decisions as to how that money is being spent. So this is causing a lot of tension between local and state officials.
Another teacher, Joe, is in Indianapolis. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I would just comment, I taught in the Indianapolis public school system about 20 years ago. I left. I'm retired now. I went to a parochial school system. And basically the teachers' unions are just destroying most of the actual livelihood of a teacher. Most of these students now, they couldn't tell you what a noun and a verb or an adverb, or they're very pretty much significant issues that you could see even on the college campus. It's all a progressive thought, most public schools. It's all about teachers and the teacher's power.
Joe, you're going a little in now, but I think we got your sentiment.
Another interesting state. So Indiana, Governor Holcomb, during his State of the State address this year, said, I'm going to actually pay down the district's pension debt. I'm going to spend $150 million, I think he was saying, in order to pay down the pension debt. But he reminded citizens there, I do not have the power to actually raise teachers' pay. And this is considering that IPS at Indianapolis, teachers there have been threatening a strike across the state. There are a lot of teachers in rural Indiana who are not being paid a lot. They've reached the top of the pay scale and they still can't afford to pay their rent. So he told school board members, he specifically directed at looked at school board members and said, please use this money to provide teachers a pay raise. He actually cited a number. He said all teachers should be able to get a $1,200 pay increase with this money. Now, if school board members across the state are actually going to listen to the governor and do that next year, we don't know. But this is one of the frustrations that Indiana teachers are having.
I want to get your thoughts on this tweet from Still an Individual as we've been having this discussion. Still an Individual writes that teacher pay should be linked to a test coming into the semester and a test coming out that show growth for the student. Some kids, he writes, have limited English language skills upon graduation, and that determines their success in business leadership.
So this is a proposal in Texas, actually, where the lieutenant governor actually wants to link up any pay increase to test scores. The problem with that is that, as a lot of citizens feel, we are way too dependent on tests in order to determine the success of schools. But then also, the teachers who ended up getting pay raises when you link pay to test scores, we've seen this across the nation, is the teachers at wealthier school districts. So these are schools in which there's not concentrated poverty. There are not a significant number of English language learners. There are not a significant number of kids who are coming to school tired, et cetera. And so those teachers are getting pay raises where, in reality, as states know, where there are teacher shortages are in urban and rural areas in which it's very hard to recruit and retain teachers.
Edward is a parent in Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well.
I have a question concerning teacher pensions. Do the teachers themselves contribute money toward their retirement system? And the other question concerning pensions are they completely funded, or are they like some businesses in years gone by, they're unfunded liabilities, and then when the company goes belly up, the government pays, and then the government pension guarantee fund goes belly up? That's my two questions.
Gerald Burnett.
Yeah, so this depends on which state or which district you're in as to whether or not teachers are contributing. But as we've reported several times at Education Week, these pension funds, it's a third rail in education. West Virginia, which is where they had a statewide teacher strike last year, that was over specifically pensions, in which the state tried to actually, or Kentucky, I'm sorry, Kentucky, in which the state actually tried to change the dynamics of the pension system, tried to get teachers to contribute more, tried to change exactly what the promise was that they were giving teachers. And the teachers were so upset about this that they stopped going to school, basically. They stopped working. So this is a third rail in the sense that a lot of politicians don't want to touch pensions, but at the same time they know that this could potentially drive the state into insolvency.
By the way, Education Week is where Darrell Burnett works. It's edweek.org if you want to find them, all of his reporting there. Sheila is waiting in Tacoma, Washington next. The teacher, good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
I'm calling. I'm a preschool teacher, and I do it for the love, not for the money, because a lot of them can't read. And when I was going to school, we did it they need to go back to the old way where they do it on paper and pen, because they complain about it, and it comes from the homeowners when you own a home.
What do you mean by that, Sheila?
It comes from people that own homes. That's what I'm saying. And they do funding where they get puzzles and they get paper and stuff, and they don't bring that up. I live in Tacoma, Washington. I was 18 and I'm 63 now, and I'm getting very involved in the community.
Darrell Burnett, anything you want to take from that?
No, another interesting state. So Washington State was in a years-long legal lawsuit with the state Supreme Court there over whether or not the state or the local officials should be paying for education costs. The state ended up getting rid of the pay scale, getting rid of the statewide pay scale. The governor contributed $1 billion more to schools last year and said this money is for teacher pay, but he put it in districts' general funds. The vast majority of districts in that state said we can give you a pay over the next 3 years, over the next 4 years. There were some districts in the Seattle area that were able to give huge double-digit pay increases, but in this caller's district, Tacoma, Washington, the district said no, and they tried to stand down against the teachers and say we will give you a smaller increase than what the teachers were demanding. The teachers there ended up going on strike, delayed the start of school for a day or two, I think. But one of the things that happened in Washington, which was kind of fascinating, was the teachers union sent out a press release to all the teachers in the state saying you can get a 20 to 30% raise this year, which if my boss said, 20% raise, you better, you'd be okay with that? You better know. Well, not only would I be okay with that, but I would recalibrate my budget. I would say, okay, I know that I can actually afford this. I might think of, having kids next year, et cetera. But what ended up happening is the district said, we can't afford that. So when it came to negotiations, which was several months later, the district said, we'll give you a 10% raise, we'll give you a 5% raise, which upset the teachers even more. And I think that you're going to see a lot more tension in the coming months as these states are going to, they're giving, $100, $200 million more, but those are one-time funds. They are not, they're not recurable, or they're not occurring several years over the next couple of years. They're not recurring is what I'm trying to say. And districts are saying, I will put that in my savings account, I will buy laptop computers for the kids, et cetera. So
let's talk Wisconsin. Stephen is in Racine. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call, C-SPAN. Very good conversation, and I just have a question for you folks. Is there any data available on the benefit expenses? I think we're talking about wages here, which is what I bring home at the end of the week or biweekly. But what about my benefit expenses and the increases in benefit expenses for these individuals?
Yes, this is one of the things that I was kind of fascinated. I went to one of the protests in Arizona, and a lot of the teachers are telling me, hey, they're saying we'll give you a $2,000 raise this year. The districts are telling us we'll give you a $2,000 raise this year, but then you're going to have to pay $1,000 more for your health care. So one of the things that the districts are doing is they're basically asking teachers to chip in on their health care costs. And so effectively it's saying I actually got no raise because I'm paying just as much toward my benefits as they said I would get as a raise. So healthcare costs is something that districts are just, they're burdened by, and they're trying to shoulder that burden onto the teachers. And a lot of teachers are saying that's just not really fair.
Shelby's next. School administrator in Tallahassee, Florida. Shelby, what kind of school?
An HBCU, FAMU, which is university here with Florida State, has teaching college, trying to prepare pedagogy and methodology for future teachers. Florida is ground zero for this issue. Back in about 20 years ago, the Republican Party took over this state and instituted a testing accountability grading system, Jeb Bush. This was done at the behest of the Koch brothers and an Alex Legislative Council lobby that then carried this forward. And this grading of schools, A, B, C, D, to F, whereby then funding was tied to testing and grading on teachers and on school district support for pay. Most of the educational funding for our local school districts throughout this entire nation come from property taxes. I think the lady was trying to say that, but she wasn't clear in it when she was speaking of in Washington. So we have a 90%, basically 10% federal funding. We also have an issue here where when we had a segregated school system in America, we then funded at one time, and it wasn't until the 70s that that case basically came to fruition, where we were funding private segregated academies. Now, this is what this voucher school choice is about. They have always complained that they're paying property taxes, but their children are not in the schools. And so, therefore, we've had this is an underbelly fight, really, about Brown v. Board, where we talk about funding paying teachers. I grew up in a segregated segregated school system where most of my teachers who had come out of Fisk, Xavier, Dillard, black women, because teaching profession primarily right now is a 80% white woman profession in America. Our children are 80 to 90% black and brown, and then we have a good group. I say 70. I don't want you to use a number to try to downgrade what I'm saying in the main. Okay, this is about a system that now has white women, the majority of the teachers in America, with public school teaching. And then we have the funding for this coming from property taxes. Now, I support general education funding the education fund is taking it off the property tax. So once you retire, retirees, my mom, their property taxes are not going to be able to be sustained to increase this. When you also have the pension debate is also tied to funding.
Joe, but you bring up a lot of issues. Darrell Burnett, let you jump in.
Yeah, well, first of all, my grandmother's a graduate of the Teachers College at FAMU, so but I wanted to point out the fact that it's true that America has tied its school funding to property taxes, and because of that, this is one of the key reasons why a lot of states are having a difficult time raising money for schools, in the sense that a lot of voters do not want their taxes to be raised. I mean, one of the kind of interesting political dynamics that we're seeing now, which is kind of a new phenomenon, is the fact that a lot of folks have a lot of sympathy for teachers, but at the same time, they don't want their taxes to be increased. And so, we have decided that property tax, I shouldn't even say we have decided property tax is one of the most reliable sources of funds for schools. It does not fluctuate dramatically. It's an even tax, et cetera. But at the same time, folks already feel as if their property taxes are too high. So state politicians and local politicians are having to decide, okay, do we go to income taxes? Do we go to sales taxes? Which some of those taxes are regressive taxes, actually, where the poor are actually paying the vast majority of funds. But she also mentioned the fact that, this has different impact on different communities. And one of the interesting phenomenons that I'm seeing too is that for districts that have high local property tax value, suburban districts, some of the urban districts, Seattle, for example, I mentioned Washington State, they can afford large teacher increases, and oftentimes those teachers are demanding that because they can't afford to live in, they can't afford their rent, basically. But at the same time, you're seeing rural communities that have very low property tax value. They are not able to afford the tax increase. So this has a disproportionate impact on the haves and have-nots, in which now all of a sudden this is exacerbating the teacher shortage, in which I'm in a rural district, I'm trying to recruit teachers and I can only afford to pay $30,000. Again, average pay kind of masks actually what's happening in districts. There are districts outside of New York City that are paying $250,000 a year for teachers. Chicago suburbs is another example. There are also districts in Oklahoma and rural Oklahoma in which those teachers are maxing out at $35,000. So there's just a large differentiation based off of where you are working, based off of what type of teacher you are, et cetera. So
just a few minutes left and lots of callers waiting to chat with you. We'll try to get to a few of them. Michael in Jackson, Mississippi, a parent. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Doing well. Go ahead.
Thanks for the call. Question. Well, question/comment. Like I said, I live in Jackson, Mississippi. No need to shoot the numbers. We know we're pretty much last everywhere. Far as the teachers, far as the administration, here in Jackson, so as the superintendent itself, why is the administration paid so much and the teachers are paid, less? And my comment, our guest thought is, opinion that I want to give is, why aren't we asking industry to kick in, far as property tax and also investing into the schools also, as far as, new technology and things of that sort? Thanks, gentlemen.
Joe Burnett.
Sure. So superintendent's pay is actually something that a lot of folks target and a lot of people are upset about. One of the things that I think, especially for urban districts like Jackson, which has a lot of turnover at the superintendent level, school boards are having a very difficult time recruiting and retaining superintendent positions. They're very political. They're a very difficult job to do, et cetera. But I want to reemphasize, 80% of districts' funds are going to teacher salaries. They are not going to overhead staff. So even if you reduce the superintendent salary, even if you get rid of office staff, I've been in central office staff in which there are no secretaries, there are no deputy superintendents, there's no professional development for teachers, et cetera. Even if you get rid of all those folks, the vast majority of district funds are going to teacher salaries. So this is just something to keep in mind as we debate these topics.
Ronnie is a parent in Georgia. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, C-SPAN. Thanks for taking my call. Mr. Barnett, that's a good topic this morning. What I have no problem with the state giving teachers the pay. What I have a problem with, when you have a low pay status, you have teachers that's coming in, but in some sense, they're not qualified to teach their subject that they're teaching. In some states now, we ask our kids during semester to test those kids to see how they qualify to go to the next grade level. Why aren't we testing our teachers to see how they're qualified to teach the subject they're teaching? And we in Georgia, we have a lot of kids that's failing in math, reading, history, and a lot of subjects there. Because the teacher's low pay, we just grabbing teachers from anywhere in some sense. Now, I'm not saying in all cases that's actually getting teachers to teach, but are they qualified to teach that particular subject? We need to test the teacher before they go into that teaching process. Every year they say, okay, you get your master's, and then you teach. But are you qualified, if you understand what I'm saying, to teach the subject that you're teaching to our youth?
Got your question, Ronnie.
This is what I was on this program last time. States have a very difficult time defining teacher quality. It is a very politically thorny subject. Every parent has a different definition. Every teacher has a different definition as to what is a quality teacher. Every politician has a different definition. And so what ends up happening is states try to avoid the question altogether. And so the vast majority of teachers are paid based off of years of experience, which most folks will say that is actually not a good indicator as to how good you're teaching every day. Do we tie it to test scores? Well, testing is somewhat of a flawed way of teaching or of judging the quality of teachers, some folks will say. We don't want to be too dependent on tests. Do we depend on surveys? Do we depend on how many master's degrees they have? This is just a question that states have not tackled, and until they tackle these sorts of questions and they come up with an answer that everybody can agree upon, you're going to continue seeing these debates in states.
Last call from Wisconsin. Michelle is a parent. Good morning.
Good morning. I support raising taxes for teachers in public schools. I think the problem is these charter schools are taking over, and number one, they're getting more of the funding than public schools when property taxes is supposed to go to public schools, not to private schools. And I don't know how many jobs out there where like teachers, they're constantly taking their work home. They're starting early in the mornings before students get there, and they're staying after school, helping students, and then they go home and they have to grade papers and everything. So as far as I'm concerned, they are not getting paid enough regardless. And a lot of parents out there feel that the teachers have to teach them morals and values and everything, which should be done also at home. So I support the local public schools. I say charter schools are hiring teachers who are not qualified, who are not licensed, and yet they are getting most of the funding. And that's not what my property taxes are supposed to go for. So
Daryl Burnett, final minute.
Yeah, Wisconsin is an interesting state. One of the things to keep in mind is that only 5% of America's kids attend charter schools. The crux of the problem in Wisconsin is that they are losing thousands of students a year. These districts, I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin a couple of months ago during the election where Governor Tony Evers ran on the issue of school funding, said, I'm not going to raise your taxes, but I will provide $1 billion more for schools. He's still trying to find the money for that. The problem with Wisconsin is that they are losing thousands and thousands of students a year, and that's causing all sorts of issues with districts because they have a per pupil system. They're losing money from the state. They're losing money from their property values, et cetera. But yes, in Milwaukee, Racine, et cetera, they do have a large number of charter schools and students that are using vouchers. But the rest of the state, these districts are just losing kids left and right.
Daryl Burnett is a state policy reporter at Education Week. It's edweek.org if you want to see his work. Thanks as always for your time.
Thank you.
And this evening, Senate Democratic Whip Dick Durbin of Illinois will talk about the Senate Democratic agenda leading up to 2020. Live from Georgetown University at 7 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. And later this week, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker will testify on the special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Live from the House Judiciary Committee, Friday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
Over the last year, the world has seen what we always knew, that no people on earth are so fearless or daring or determined as Americans. If there is a mountain, we climb it. If there's a frontier, we cross it. If there's a challenge, we tame it. If there's an opportunity, we seize it. So let's begin tonight by recognizing that the state of our union is strong because our people are strong.
The State of the Union, first postponed because of the government shutdown, will now take place on Tuesday night. Watch as President Trump delivers his State of the Union address live from the House chamber, beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, followed by the Democratic response by former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. The State of the Union, live Tuesday at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN, cspan.org, or listen with the free C-SPAN radio app.
I'm always enthralled by the Senate chamber itself, the walls themselves. Oh, if they could speak, what could they tell us? What would they tell us?
C-SPAN's newest book, The Senate, transports you inside the Senate wing of the Capitol, revealing rich architectural details of the Senate chamber, its ornate hallways, private workspaces, and elaborate historic meeting rooms. This keepsake is filled with beautiful color photos of the art and architecture that pervade the Senate space and offers lots of information about the Senate's rich history. To order your high-quality paperback copy of The Senate for just $18.95 plus shipping, visit cspan.org/senatebook.
Don Ritchie, when did this address become a traditional annual address?
It has a variety of histories. It started out as an annual address in person way back in 1789 when George Washington gave a State of the Union message, and Washington and Adams did it in person. Then Thomas Jefferson stopped that practice and started sending up the message. Went until 1913 when you finally had Woodrow Wilson deciding that he would come in person to Congress. And since then, every president has come in person, except for Herbert Hoover, who didn't like to speak in public and didn't really have a good dealings with Congress, so he sent his message. But every other president's made a big deal out of coming up for this, and it's gotten bigger with radio and then television and the internet. So it's a huge event these days.
Why did Thomas Jefferson decide to deliver his in writing, and would he approve of this annual showing?
I think Thomas Jefferson would disdain this annual showing. He thought that it was much too much like the king going to Parliament. It was too fancy, that the executive should stay in the executive branch and the legislative branch was separate. Jefferson didn't like to speak in public. He only gave 2 speeches while he was president. Both of them were his inaugural addresses. And so he thought it was fine to send a written message up to Congress. And then every one of his predecessors in the 19th century and the early 20th century all followed suit. And apparently it was a pretty boring affair because the clerk would stand up in the Senate and the House and read out, sort of drone through this message. Members would look through their own copies and they would drift in and out. There was no drama to it. But Wilson wanted to be a prime minister as much as a president, and he thought he needed to be in Congress personally to lead his forces, and he did turn it into a very dramatic event.
Well, what is it about the evening that Jefferson did not approve of? It's been said it's like the speech from the throne. I mean,
yes.
What is it about the optics?
Yes, well, they always use the British Parliament when they would discuss setting up our American Constitution, but they usually used it as a bad example, and they just didn't want to copy that. And the idea that the king would come and the king would march through the chambers and all the members of the House of Commons would march over to the House of Lords, it just was too regal as far as Jefferson. Jefferson was a small R Republican, and he really believed in more limited government. He was trying to cut down essentially the imperial presidency of George Washington and John Adams, because Jefferson also had big majorities in both the Senate and the House, and so he could get his way without having to go up and give a speech. He also just didn't like public speaking, and he set the practice then of sending up the message, and the messages got longer and longer and longer, and they're really a very long laundry list of what a president would like Congress to do in the current years. The recent speeches, because they're delivered orally, have been cut down considerably. And then usually the presidents will send up a sort of an augmented message with all the detail that they didn't say while they were in the chamber.
President Trump is delivering this address in what some have described as times of turmoil. There's a special counsel investigation. The government was just shut down for over a month, and there is a looming government shutdown, a possible one again. Have there been other presidents in the past that have delivered a State of the Union under similar circumstances?
Perhaps not similar, but unusual circumstances. I think perhaps the most unusual was in 1999, while the Senate was holding an impeachment trial of the President of the United States. The President chose to come up and give his State of the Union message as if nothing was happening. I think it really surprised everybody. They thought maybe he would just send up the message or whatever, but he made it clear that he was doing business as usual. It somewhat took the steam out of the whole impeachment process at the time, but I remember that as sort of the more stunning and surprising of all the State of the Union messages. There have been some sad moments. President Reagan had to delay his State of the Union message for a week because the Challenger exploded, the space shuttle. There have been some dramatic moments, right after the wars have been declared or right after an assassination. There have certainly been moments that have been heightened, perhaps, in terms of the drama. But every year, a State of the Union message is a dramatic effect. Other than the inauguration, it's the only time when all of the branches of the government come together. And you've got the Supreme Court sitting there, you've got the military sitting there, you have the cabinet sitting there, you have the Senate, the House, the diplomats, the spouses and their guests in the gallery. Every seat in the press gallery is taken. So it's a very high drama situation no matter what.
do the presidents who have delivered State of the Unions under unusual circumstances address what is happening outside of that night?
It depends on the president. President Clinton, I don't think, made any reference to his impeachment. Other presidents will talk about the circumstances of the time, and they'll use it for dramatic effect. And especially because they are talking about the State of the Union. Is it good or is it bad? And if their times are hard, presidents will use that to say, you know, we're in a fix and we've got to do something about it. And they then throw down the gauntlet to Congress to at least to address their issues, maybe not to do it the way they want, but at least to come up with some solution to these situations.
Do low approval ratings impact how and when and if a president gives a State of the Union address? Truman was at 22% in his last year when he delivered his last State of the Union address.
The president's approval ratings go up and down. Certainly, President Nixon's were very high at one point and very low at the end of his administration. There is a sort of boring factor that works its way in. If you notice, if you look at the statistics on who listens, it's always higher at the very beginning of a presidency. And especially if a person serves 8 years, the audience goes down and down with each one. But it still gets millions of people who are listening on television, on radio, or watching it streamed live. People around the world, and other governments, of course, are going to be very interested in knowing what this president's going to say, because part of the speech does deal with foreign policy. This is the speech where George W. Bush talked about the axis of evil, for instance. And so it has a large international audience as well as a national audience.
Some have compared this speech by the president to the one that Benjamin Harris gave in 1891 when the issue was illegal immigration from China.
Yeah. Yes, you know, a lot of issues in American history are evergreens. They come back. Immigration has always been an issue. We're a nation of immigrants. At various times we've been very accepting of immigrants, and then at other times we put on all sorts of restrictions on immigrants. We often make distinctions between different groups, and Chinese immigration was a controversial issue in the 1890s. So many of the issues that the president is going to address are ones that his predecessors have talked about, some of which have had sort of temporary solutions, some of which have had solutions that worked for a long time but have become old-fashioned, some of which he just doesn't like and he'll want to replace. So it's not that all of these will be brand new issues. It's more theme and variation.
Let's talk about the traditions of the night. What is happening on the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol?
Yes, well, the Senate will start off with a dinner that the Secretary of the Senate will host for the senators and their spouses. And if tradition holds, the menu will involve chicken pot pie, which one of the former curators, Jim Ketchum, developed years ago. And each Secretary of the Senate has kept up the menu. The one who tried to change the menu got a lot of protests from the senators and went back to the wonderful chicken pot pies. But then after the dinner, they will gather in the Senate chamber, and they will then march 2 by 2 with the Vice President leading the procession, because the Vice President is the President of the Senate. And they'll march from the Senate chamber to the House chamber. The various times that I got to walk in that procession, I'll tell you, if you're at the very end of the procession, which is where the staff are, you have to run because it's a little bit like crack the whip. The first people are practically in the House chamber by the time the last ones leave the Senate chamber. But they get there, then they will then take special seats that will have, say, reserved for the Senate. And in recent years, there's been a tradition to try to break it up so that Republicans and Democrats walk together and they're not quite so separate when they get into the chamber. It was after the shooting of Congressman Giffords that Senator Udall suggested that that would be a nice tradition to follow. And for the most part, they have done that in recent years. They'll be in the chamber then as all the other guests are announced coming in. There will be at least 1 or 2 members of the Senate who will not be there because each branch of the government designates somebody to stay home just in case there's an emergency, because this is the one time when everyone is gathered in the same room. And at least since the 1950s in the nuclear age, there was this sense that it's not safe to have everybody in the government in one place at the same time. There are also some members of the Senate who won't go just because they've been to too many of these in the past. I remember Senator Byrd, Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia, tended not to go in his last few years unless he was called upon as president pro tempore of the Senate to preside, and he always came to preside. But otherwise, there were a lot of speeches he just didn't want to listen to.
Any similar traditions for House lawmakers?
They will also designate someone not to be there, because it's in the House chamber, it's their bailiwick. The Speaker of the House will be sitting up at the podium. The Speaker is sort of in charge, as President Trump discovered this time, that Speaker makes up decisions. It's the Speaker's house, essentially, and the House of Representatives is run from the top down. The Senate is run from the floor up, they say, but clearly the Speaker of the House and the leadership of the House make the decisions. And of course, not only will all the members be there, but usually their spouses will be in the galleries. Sometimes their key staff members will be there. Sometimes key, generous constituents will be there. Each member gets one ticket for the galleries. It's a pretty limited space. There will be lots of gatherings in the various offices, and then after the speech, there'll be a mad rush to go to Statuary Hall, where there'll be dozens of television cameras set up, and all the members will rush to give their take on what they just saw. And there's an old saw in the Capitol building that the most dangerous place to stand is between a member of Congress and a television camera.
On the night of the speech, can you think of other previous speeches where there's been a dynamic between the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House sitting right behind him?
Not every president has been in agreement with every speaker sitting back up there. President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich were certainly at odds. That was one of the big government shutdowns, the disagreement between them. There have been numbers of occasions where the people sitting behind the president have sometimes looked a little uncomfortable, or sometimes looked like they were sort of very happy in charge. And it just depends. Vice presidents usually have to be attentive. If they yawn or look elsewhere, it'll be a picture in the newspaper the next day. But on the other hand, they don't want to overshadow the president of their party in front of them. So their position sometimes is a little bit more difficult than the Speaker of the House, who's presiding over the chamber in which the Speaker is in charge.
Have the Supreme Court justices always attended the address?
Not always. They sometimes are there in mass, and they're sometimes there if some of them have stopped coming. A few of them feel that it's quite improper for them to be there because it's essentially a political discussion. They sit there very quietly. They're not supposed to applaud. One made a sort of a facial gesture once about disagreeing with something, and that was immediately criticized. Your position is a little dicey, and so same thing with military officers. I think they often feel quite uncomfortable. They're the ones who are not standing up and applauding when the members of the president's party are doing that. And of course, Supreme Court justices tend to be in their 70s and 80s, and some of them tend to doze off occasionally during long speeches, and that's understandable. But of course, you're on camera when you're doing that.
They also have their dinner before they go over to listen to the president.
It's a ceremonial event that it has a lot of socializing. A lot of members do this, a lot of senators, a lot of representatives. The press gallery will, as I say, will be absolutely packed. Quite often when you're sitting in the Senate or House chamber on a regular day, there are only 2 or 3 people sitting in the press gallery. But every seat will be taken, and people will be standing in the back for the State of the Union message.
Who are the groups, the other groups that are announced, and why are they announced in that way? When did it become important to mark their presence?
Right. Well, this is traditional, and usually the doorkeepers of the House make the announcement. And there are different groups. There is the Diplomatic Corps, for instance. They come. There's always been a gallery, ever since there have been galleries, but there's been one that's been designated for the Diplomatic Corps. And of course, in addition to the Senate and the House and the Supreme Court and the Cabinet and the military offices, you also have the First Family, always sitting in the front row. And in recent years, they've brought special guests along with them, some of whom will be mentioned during the speech. So part of the formality is just to let people know what's happening and how close are we getting to the actual date, or the actual time in which the president is going to arrive. But it adds a little bit to the drama, to the dignity of the situation.
Some lawmakers are also bringing guests that they believe send a political message. Is that new?
That's relatively new. In recent years, because the president is bringing a guest for certain optical reasons, some members of Congress are bringing people that they think will make a statement in reverse. And so it usually gets some attention, but that is, in the last few years, politics in general on Capitol Hill have gotten much more polarized. And so when you have a polarized situation, if one side's going to do one thing, the other side's going to counter it with another way. And so it automatically develops that way. It gets ratcheted up one step each time.
What about protests, either silent or yelling out in the middle of the State of the Union?
Yes. Well, we're not a parliament. And if you've ever sat in any parliament around the world, the first thing you notice is that members heckle each other across the aisle. They're usually facing each other. There's a lot of noise, a lot of desk pounding, and a lot of disbelief when a person is speaking. The rules of the Senate and the House require members to be much politer. There's got to be decorum. And one of the issues is whether or not you disagree with a speaker. Do you make it known at the time? Well, if you agree, you can applaud, and if you disagree, you can sit on your hands. But as one member discovered when he shouted out, "You lie," when the president was speaking, he was censured by the House of Representatives the next day because no one considers that an appropriate response. You may dislike what the president is saying, but you'd be outraged if a president of your party was speaking and was insulted like that. So I think both parties in both houses realize that while you can show your enthusiasm in support of it, you need to be muted in your opposition.
There are two Democrats that we know of so far who are not attending as a protest.
Yes, I'm sure people can disagree with a president and decide they don't want to sit and listen to them. They can do that if they don't care about the speech one way or the other. There are a lot of members who just don't show up for the event. But the difference is if you put out a press release and say, "I'm not there for a particular reason," and then you're drawing attention to your disagreements with the president. Because one of the issues is that State of the Union message is when the president outlines what he would like to see done during the next congressional session. And so every member of Congress, to some degree, has to be aware of what he's asking for. They're certainly not going to give him everything he wants, but he's setting the agenda to some degree. Of course, tomorrow you can read the whole thing in the Congressional Record after it's been said. You don't have to sit there through the event, but and you can stay home and watch it on television if you choose. But they do have to be aware, and they are aware of what the president said. In the days before there were standing committees of Congress, they actually used to cut the State of the Union message apart and essentially create an ad hoc committee for each paragraph to deal with each issue that the president had arisen. And now the standing committees of Congress will be getting these issues. The bills will be introduced, and they have some sense of what the president's priority is. As I say, the presidents can ask for a lot. Whether Congress gives it to them is a different matter.
Don Ritchie, thank you.
My pleasure.
Over the last year, the world has seen what we always knew, that no people on earth are so fearless or daring or determined as Americans. If there is a mountain, we climb it. If there's a frontier, we cross it. If there's a challenge, we tame it. If there's an opportunity, we seize it. So let's begin tonight by recognizing that the state of our union is strong because our people are strong.
The State of the Union, first postponed because of the government shutdown, will now take place on Tuesday night. Watch as President Trump delivers his State of the Union address live from the House chamber, beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, followed by the Democratic response by former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams. The State of the Union, live Tuesday at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN, cspan.org, or listen with the free C-SPAN radio app.
I'm always enthralled by the Senate chamber itself, the walls themselves. Or if they could speak, what could they tell us? What would they tell us?
C-SPAN's newest book, The Senate, transports you inside the Senate wing of the Capitol, revealing rich architectural details of the Senate chamber, its ornate hallways, private workspaces, and elaborate historic meeting rooms. This keepsake is filled with beautiful color photos of the art and architecture that pervade the Senate space and offers lots of information about the Senate's rich history. To order your high-quality paperback copy of The Senate for just $18.95 plus shipping, visit cspan.org/senatebook. And this evening, Senate Democratic Whip Dick Durbin of Illinois will talk about the Senate Democratic agenda leading up to 2020. Live from Georgetown University at 7 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. And later this week, Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker will testify on the special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Live from the House Judiciary Committee, Friday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2. Pentagon officials discussed the recent missile defense review with recommendations on space-based operations, hypersonic missiles, and the F-35 fighter. This event was hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thanks to everyone for coming today. We're excited to be here to talk about the new Missile Defense Review. We're glad it's out. It's really kind of the beginning of kind of a national conversation that we're going to need to have about these issues and how to adapt our air and missile defense posture to the strategic environment described in the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. I might ask the folks in the back to maybe turn down the volume. I heard a little bit of echo on my mic, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you very much. So also, just before we begin, we always have to say, just in case we have any reason that we need to depart the building, look to me. I'll give you directions either down the stairs or out the back. We don't expect any such problems, but please do look to me in case we need to depart. So first of all, I want to welcome to CSIS my good friend Dave Trachtenberg, who since October 2017 has been the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He's got more than 35 years of public policy experience in the private sector and the executive and legislative branches. He served, for instance, from 2001 to 2003 as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy and as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Forces. Both jobs at the same time? That's pretty good. He's headed numerous interagency delegations on missile defense, including with our Russian friends, and was previously a professional staff member with House Armed Services Committee. Also want to welcome back to CSIS Lieutenant General Samuel Greaves. General Greaves is, of course, the director of the Missile Defense Agency. He's held a number of distinguished positions within the Air Force, including as the director of Strategic Plans, Programs, and Analyses at Air Force Space Command, as deputy director of the Missile Defense Agency, and then as commander of Space and Missile Systems Center for Air Force Space Command. Well, we're gonna jump right into it. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Trachtenberg first with a couple of questions. First, to just get us started and situate this review. What's the big new idea? What's the big idea? And its logic, especially with respect to the National Defense Strategy and the big muscle movements that are going on.
Sure, Tom. First, let me just start by thanking you and CSIS for the invitation to come here and have a conversation about this issue today. It's always a pleasure to be here with General Greaves as well as the Director of the Missile Defense Agency. So my sincere appreciation to folks, and I appreciate everybody coming out here under the circumstances on a very snowy day here in the nation's capital. So thank you for coming here for this conversation. In terms of big ideas, there are probably several. Let me just say that I think what we've done in this missile defense review is essentially revitalize and re-energize our missile defense posture and our programs. and our activities. And what I mean by that basically is that we've sort of taken a holistic view. It's been a good, 9 years almost since the last ballistic missile defense review came out. This missile defense review drops the word ballistic from the title because we are now recognizing that the nature of missile threats to both the United States homeland as well as to friends and allies abroad in our deployed forces go beyond just ballistic missiles. So they involve cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles,